On a day dedicated to America's war dead, President Trump pays his respects as the political turmoil swirling around him takes a personal turn. This is Special Report. Good evening. I'm James Rosen, sitting in for Bret Baier. President Trump today expressed what he called the nation's boundless and undying gratitude to the Americans who have fallen in battle and to the families they left behind. The day of unity comes with the president freshly returned from his first foreign trip to a Washington seemingly obsessed with his political troubles. Attention has now come to focus on the senior advisor who is married to the president's daughter. Correspondent Kristen Fisher kicks off our Memorial Day coverage from the White House tonight. Good evening, Kristen.
Good evening, James. Well, behind the scenes, the controversy surrounding Jared Kushner is taking up a lot of oxygen here at the White House. But today, President Trump reserved all of his public remarks and almost all of his tweets for the men and women who died defending this country.
The commander-in-chief visiting Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery, the section where U.S. military members killed in Iraq and Afghanistan are buried. Their families standing over their tombstones and sharing their painful stories with President Trump.
Jimmy knew he wasn't coming home, and he said he said, Mama, I hope that people don't forget that I ever lived. And if you could remember just Jimmy, that would mean so much to me. I was a Marine also, and a Marine and mother of a Marine. It would mean so much to me, sir.
We will do it.
While we cannot know the extent of your pain, what we do know is that our gratitude to them and to you is boundless and undying.
After laying a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, President Trump also paid tribute to his Homeland Security Secretary, whose son died fighting for the Marine Corps in Afghanistan.
He understands more than most ever could or ever will the wounds and burdens of war.
Yesterday, it was Secretary Kelly's turn to defend the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, against allegations that he'd attempted to establish a secret back channel with the Kremlin.
Any channel of communication, back or otherwise, with a country like Russia is a good thing.
Secretary Kelly wouldn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either, saying if Kushner did try to set up a secret line to Russia, that it's normal, acceptable, and not that big a deal. Republican Senator John McCain disagrees.
My view of it is I don't like it. I just don't. I know that some administration officials are saying, well, that's standard procedure. I don't think it's standard procedure.
Fox's Catherine Herridge is reporting a source close to Kushner argues it was the Russians who first raised the issue, not Kushner, and that it was only discussed for a single call about Syria, not as a permanent back channel, as the Washington Post, which broke the story, alleged. Even Senator Lindsey Graham, who doesn't always see eye to eye with this administration, says he doesn't trust it.
I think it makes no sense that the Russian ambassador would report back to Moscow on a channel that he most likely knows we're monitoring. The whole storyline is suspicious.
Still, the negative press is casting a shadow over the senior advisor, once thought to be untouchable, and right when rumors of a staff shakeup are heating up. Now, the White House insists that any changes will be about adding to the team, not getting rid of people already in the West Wing. President Trump told the New York Times last night that he has total confidence in Kushner, but Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff is now calling for his security clearance to be reviewed.
You have to ask, well, who are they hiding the conversations from?
And that is a question that Jared Kushner will almost certainly be asked if he testifies on Capitol Hill. And tonight, a source close to Kushner says that he's eager to do so. James.
Kristen Fisher on the North Lawn tonight. Kristen, thank you. The president wasted little time returning to the Twitterverse, his aim in part to present an optimistic view of his ability to enact his policy agenda on Capitol Hill. Correspondent Doug McKelway reports tonight on the president's prospects for success on that front.
Hoping to carry over some of the momentum from what many regard as a mostly successful first foreign trip as president, Donald Trump is preparing to again tackle domestic policy in the so-called swamp of Washington.
Do you notice how much stronger we're getting? Have you feeling it? Are you feeling it?
It won't be easy. His domestic agenda remains under relentless attack from Democrats and mainstream media. With the fiscal year ending September 30th, the clock is an enemy too.
It's obvious that not all of those things are going to get done in the next 3 months.
Adding to to the uncertainty, a fractured Republican Party. While the GOP controls both houses, the two have not yet agreed on an Obamacare replacement bill.
The House product, the Senate will have its own product. We will go to conference.
Complicating the GOP's lack of a coordinated health care message, the president's freelance tweeting. It continued last night with, quote, "Suggests we add more dollars to health care and make it the best anywhere. Obamacare is dead. The Republicans will do much better." That's a tough sell for a president who once wanted to cut health care spending, and for his party, which still does. Republicans also remain divided over the president's budget. The chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee noting that Mr. Trump's long-held promise of rebuilding the military falls short.
It does not rebuild the military. It doesn't give us the ships and the numbers of personnel we need, the capabilities we need.
That while Democrats hammer the budget from the other side.
I do not believe you make America great again by cutting medical research to the lowest level in 12 years. I don't think you make America great again by saying to working families it's now more expensive for your kids to borrow money for student loans. You certainly don't make us a great nation by cutting back in infrastructure. All those three things are in the Trump budget.
Accused of a morally bankrupt budget, the president's budget point man fired back.
Because right now, my unborn grandchildren are paying for it, and I think that is morally bankrupt.
Congress reconvenes the week of June 5th with another week-long break for the 4th of July and a 6-week-long August recess ending September 4th. Not a lot of time to handle a calendar that is chock full of major legislation. James?
Doug McKelway. Doug, thanks so much. Germany's foreign minister said today President Trump's policies are short-sighted and have weakened the West. It's just the latest criticism of the American leader from Europeans who've begun calling on their continental neighbors to stand on their own and rely less on the U.S. Here is correspondent Rich Edson.
He challenged Europe to accept more responsibility. And following President Trump's first overseas trip, European leaders appear to have received that message.
The times in which we can fully count on others are somewhat over, as I've experienced in the past few days.
A trip that began with an opulent embrace of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia ended with a scolding of European democracies. In a speech last week to NATO, the president chided allies for failing to meet agreed-upon spending guidelines, that the 28 NATO members would spend at least 2% of the size of their economies on defense. Only 5 do so.
Other member nations must pay more. The U.S. is currently paying much more than any other nation, and that is not fair to the United States or the United States taxpayer.
President Trump also failed to explicitly mention the U.S. commitment to Article 5, a section of NATO's treaty stating an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all. However, senior administration officials later confirmed the U.S. is committed to NATO and its defense. Merkel says Europeans will maintain friendships with the United States and Great Britain, even as the United Kingdom negotiates its withdrawal from the European Union, though she is encouraging a stronger Europe.
We have to know that we have to fight for our future and our fate ourselves as Europeans.
The president also shared a tense, lengthy handshake with newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron. He told a French publication, quote, "My handshake with President Trump was not innocent, not the alpha and the omega of a policy, but a moment of truth. We must show that we will not make small concessions, even symbolic ones." President Trump says he will decide this week whether he will withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement on climate change. Merkel says the G7 conversation with President Trump on that topic amounted to 6 against 1. James.
Rich Edson, thanks. It is becoming almost a weekly exercise, and tonight we are again confronted with a North Korean missile test, one that could bring the communist regime closer to its goal of attaining a nuclear weapon. Lucas Tomlinson is live at the Pentagon with details on the latest launch. Good evening, Lucas.
Good evening, James. U.S. officials say the Scud-C missile splashed down 240 miles from Japan after first reaching outer space. It's North Korea's 3rd consecutive missile test in the past 3 weekends, going back to Mother's Day. Yesterday, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says it's not just the missiles he's concerned about.
The North Korean regime has hundreds of artillery cannons and rocket launchers within range of one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, which is the capital of South Korea. But the bottom line is it would be a catastrophic war if this turns into combat.
Fox News has also learned about a separate test this weekend involving a surface-to-air missile called the KN-06, similar to the Russian S-300 design. Images from North Korea's state-run media show the presence of Kim Jong-un, leader of the rogue communist regime. U.S. officials say a North Korean MiG fighter jet crashed near the launch site of that surface-to-air missile test. In an interview on CBS, Secretary Mattis would not draw any red lines on North Korea, instead choosing to keep his cards close.
At this time, what we know, I'd prefer to keep silent about, because we may actually know some things the North Koreans don't even know.
What keeps you awake at night?
Nothing. I keep other people awake at night.
In the past few weeks, the Pentagon has doubled its firepower in the region. The USS Ronald Reagan Strike Group deployed from Japan, joining the Carl Vinson in the region, giving American commanders 2 aircraft carriers and more warships capable of launching cruise missiles. And James, the Pentagon is conducting a missile test of its own tomorrow. The Missile Defense Agency will launch an intercontinental ballistic missile from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific into space and attempt to shoot it down with an interceptor missile from a base in California. Fox News will cover it. James?
A lot riding on that. Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon tonight. Lucas, thank you. The growing concern over North Korea's nuclear ambitions is prompting lawmakers in one Pacific Northwest state to rethink a decades-old law that effectively barred authorities there from preparing for the unthinkable. And as correspondent Dan Springer reports tonight, many now find that law itself unthinkable.
While emergency planners in Hawaii quietly prepare a response to a nuclear attack, a possible target on the West Coast is barred from taking any steps. Washington state allows evacuation plans for every disaster scenario except a nuclear bomb. Former state representative Dick Nelson says planning a response only encourages an attack.
You are really sending a message that you're getting ready to do something maybe yourself.
The law passed in 1984, 7 years before the end of the Cold War. It was the opposite approach taken by President Reagan, whose peace through strength doctrine helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. A current state senator says Washington's law is irresponsible and naive.
I think it's ridiculous and silly. It's sort of the head in the sand sort of mentality.
Seattle could be in the crosshairs if Kim Jong-un ever did the unthinkable. Naval base Kitsap has some 1,300 nuclear warheads, nearly a quarter of the country's arsenal, and the largest stockpile of nukes in the world. It's also home to a major army base, is a high-tech hub, and the closest major U.S. city to North Korea. But the state's top emergency planner says the current law is no big deal.
We do not have a specific plan for a nuclear attack, nor do we have a specific plan for a volcano or a number of other types of hazards.
Robert Ezell says he needs to spend his limited resources on prepping for the most likely disasters, and there would be some overlap in the response for, say, a major earthquake or a dirty bomb attack, for which they have done drills. Military experts believe North Korea is still at least 3 years away from having the capability to hit the West Coast with a bomb. It's got the attention of West Coast lawmakers who've introduced a bill that would scrap the current restrictions and allow for the planning to save as many lives as possible. James?
Dan Springer, thanks. More arrests and more self-examination tonight in England, 1 week after that deadly bombing in Manchester. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott is in London tonight.
1 week after the brutal bombing at the Manchester Arena killed 22 and left over 100 injured, the investigation into the blast is intensifying. Police revealing new images of the 22-year-old bomber, British-Libyan Salman Abedi, just before the attack. Here he's shown with a suitcase, which might or might not contain explosive material used in making his deadly backpack bomb. Police searched a landfill near Manchester. There are fears another bomb could be out there. And in southern UK, a man who reportedly ran a Libya-based website was arrested, bringing to 14, now held by police, perhaps part of a network supporting the attacker.
Remember, this is still a live operation. We are still seeing arrests being made.
This as the investigators are also being investigated. Probes are looking at how attacker Abedi slipped through the officials' net. Sky News reporting authorities were alerted 3 times Abedi was a possible security risk. And while the man responsible for the carnage was reportedly in a group of 20,000 possible jihadis, he didn't make it into a smaller group that gets closer attention.
Someone has to risk assess whether or not that person that they're talking about is actually at what stage they are perhaps in the radicalisation process and what stage they are actually towards moving towards terrorism.
This is a long holiday weekend in the UK, too. Amid high security, events in Manchester, including a half marathon involving 40,000 runners, went ahead, a sign of defiance to the terrorists. As the victims of the attack are remembered as well, 52 remain hospitalized. Many of those killed or hurt were children or teenagers.
So you just feel it's the next best time to come down and pay your respects and just have a moment. And thank you lucky stars, you still got your girls and could have been you.
Even though the terror threat here has been downgraded to severe, some 1,000 British police and counterterrorism officials are hard at work, making sure that this terror cell, at least, doesn't strike again. James.
Greg Palcott in London tonight. When we come back, Bret Baier talks with the head of the Veterans Affairs Department about what's being done to improve medical care for America's heroes. Also, how military spouses are getting back to work from home base.
My only job at Fox is to keep company with heroes. And what I see of these youngsters makes me proud to be an American. These are guys who have been remarkably well trained. They're better equipped, better led, better trained than any military force in history. It's the best military any nation's ever had. I wouldn't trade you $1 billion for the guys I led in combat in Vietnam. These are heroes, and they're remarkable. They can go from high-octane adrenaline in a gunfight to instantly, that fast, looking after women and children. The kinds of things that I've seen them do inspires me that we really are a great country.
A U.S. Navy SEAL is being mourned tonight following his death yesterday in an unusual accident. The SEAL, who has not yet been publicly identified, served on an elite parachute team. His chute failed to open during a Fleet Week demonstration over the Hudson River. An investigation is underway. Tonight, we also, however, have some good news for military families. Correspondent Ellison Barber reports tonight on an effort to help military spouses find work while still taking care of things on the home front.
Lee Searle is a military wife and has been for 14 years, but she also had a career.
I was a lobbyist for builders and developers in Wisconsin, and I absolutely loved it.
Graduated college and received a law degree. In 14 years, she's moved 11 times.
This is our second time in Germany. We ended up moving to Missouri, which was my first duty station, and then to Germany. And all of these locations were extremely remote, and I realized that, I think it was our fourth move, perhaps, that work really wasn't going to be an option for me.
A 2012 study by the RAND Corporation found that 42% of military spouses, who are mostly women, are not in the labor force, a number nearly 2 times higher than their civilian counterparts. Searle says often it's because they don't have a choice.
It's been harder to find work because now you're overqualified for the options that are around where you live.
For her, the best option showed up online.
I started working remotely for a few companies, and I realized that that was really how I was going to be able to maintain my employment.
And she also realized she wasn't alone.
There's hundreds, literally hundreds of thousands of other military spouses who, just like me.
The mother of 2 decided to do something about it. And 3 years ago, she created a company called America's Career Force. The idea is to connect military spouses with companies looking for remote workers.
There's almost one remote job in every company, but it's not always advertised.
For Searle, this isn't about money. It's about making sure military spouses don't feel like they've lost their purpose.
We suffer sometimes in silence, and it's just the easiest thing for us is really remote work. And if more employers would just open up their doors to that and look to America's Career Force for that candidate pool, that would be incredible.
And the first family seems to be noticing what she's up to. Last year, Ivanka Trump posted about the organization on her personal website. The president shared it as well. James?
Ellison Barber in our Washington bureau tonight. Ellison, thank you. While Memorial Day commemorates those who died in service to our country, there is, of course, great concern on this holiday, indeed every day, for the veterans who live among us, especially those with serious health issues. Our own Bret Baier sat down recently with a man whose job it is to see that those needs are addressed.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for the time.
Thank you.
It's Memorial Day. Do you have a message, first of all, for the men and women of the U.S. military?
Well, this is an important time of reflection for our country. I think about all the families that today are going to be out visiting our national cemeteries. And with less than 1% of Americans now serving in our military, I think we owe those that serve a great deal of gratitude and reflect on the memory of those who have actually given their lives for our country.
You have a big job. Have things changed? Are you seeing change?
Well, I'm optimistic. I'm a doctor, so I like to put things in terms of clinical terms. We're in the intensive care unit, and we're monitoring things really closely, but I am optimistic that we're beginning to finally deal with the issues that have plagued the VA system for decades.
Have you seen wait times change?
We have. We're seeing an improvement. Our job is not done, but we now have same-day services for primary care and mental health in every one of our VAs. We've published our wait times so everybody can see where they are. We're the only system in the country that has done that, and we're working really diligently to make sure that nobody who has a urgent medical need is waiting for care.
So how did you do that? Did you do something different than Secretary McDonald was not doing?
We're doing a lot of different things. We're hiring more people. We're making sure that our leadership knows what their job is and they're focused on it. And by publishing our wait times and making them open, it's a way of actually fixing our system and making sure that people know that we're focused on the right job.
You just fired the head of the D.C. VA hospital. In late April, you fired the head of the Shreveport VA. Is it easier to fire people when you find out egregious things that are happening?
Well, it's still too hard to make sure that when our leadership loses its way, that we're able to remove them from service. So we do need legislation to help me do the job that the American people want me to do. And the House has passed a bill. We are looking forward to the Senate introducing a bill in the next few weeks so that we can get those authorities that we need.
Do you know how many people you fired?
I don't keep track of the number. I make sure that when I find a situation where somebody has really deviated from our values, that they no longer are in the VA system.
What's the biggest problem? I mean, if you were to just boil it down, what's the biggest problem in terms of services?
The biggest problem is that the VA has failed to modernize when the rest of healthcare has been actively changing and evolving. So we are hard at work at now making those decisions. The President's budget that was just given to us allows us the resources to invest in making the VA a system that we're all going to be proud of.
Yeah, taking a look at that budget, it is up $4.3 billion, roughly 5.8%, and that is seen as a plus. However, with that comes some changes that are not welcome. The American Legion is ripping the budget, saying the administration's budget would effectively lower the earnings of the most vulnerable veterans by reducing or eliminating disability payments from veterans who are most in need. This plan breaks faith with veterans. They're talking about this effort to essentially change what in essence is the unemployment payments. What about that?
Well, look, I have a great deal of respect for organizations that serve veterans like the American Legion. I take their concerns seriously. But let's remember, the budget that the President put forth is a big increase and provides more resources to the VA. What we're doing is we're also looking at our current programs and making sure that we're revising them where we think there's opportunity to shift resources to help more veterans. In the case of unemployment, this is a program that doesn't have an end to the age limit for where we pay unemployment. So we're currently paying 7,000 veterans for unemployment above the age of 80 years old. We think it's appropriate to take a look. Can we do this better so we can shift resources, not take them away, to other veterans that are in need?
Is the system overloaded with non-combat veterans?
Here is take two. In fact, it was the New York Times' Charlie Savage who first broke the NSA violations and the FISA court's intervention in an exclusive that was published on page A1 on April 28th. The Washington Post followed the next day with an article that cited the Times reporting. Then, on May 11th, after the FISA court documents were declassified on the website of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Charlie Savage again reported on the matter for the Times, including quotations from the FISA court documents. I regret those errors. Police in Portland say the man suspected of fatally stabbing two bystanders who rushed to the aid of two young women was involved in a pair of separate train station incidents one day earlier. Jeremy Joseph Christian is accused of killing two men at a station Friday. Police say his victims were standing up for two women under verbal assault by Christian. One of the women told a local TV station the suspect told them to go back to Saudi Arabia and get out of his country. President Trump tweeted, "The violent attacks in Portland on Friday are unacceptable. The victims were standing up to hate and intolerance. Our prayers are with them." Tiger Woods has been arrested on a DUI charge. Police in Florida say the golf legend was booked into a county jail around 7 o'clock this morning. He was released on his own recognizance just after 11. Woods is currently sidelined from competition after undergoing his fourth back surgery in April. He said last week he's feeling better than he has in years and has no plans to retire from competitive golf. Award-winning sports writer and commentator Frank DeFord has died. DeFord was a 6-time Sports Writer of the Year and an inductee of the Sports Writers and Broadcasters Hall of Fame. DeFord was the first sports writer awarded the National Humanities Medal by then-President Obama in 2013. He retired this month from NPR's Morning Edition after 37 years as a contributor. Frank DeFord was 78.
June 4th, get ready for the next revolution.
I promise you, we are going to shake things up.
Steve Hilton's been on the front lines of Brexit and a champion of the populist movement.
You've got to get power out of the hands of the establishment and the elite who have messed things up for so long and put it in the hands of people.
Now, he's bringing his powerful message straight to you.
People are sick and tired of the fact that whoever they vote for, nothing gets done.
See why voters are finally fed up and how you can join the movement.
This is a time of revolution. And we want
to have the president's son-in-law, a key player within the Trump organization, trying to establish a back channel with the Russians through a Russian diplomatic facility. You have to ask, well, who are they hiding the conversations from?
Multiple ways to communicate back and forth is a good thing with any country, I think, and particularly a country that's like Russia.
And this is a rumor at this point, and whether it is something that should be followed up on, I'll trust Bob Mueller's judgment.
I don't trust this story as far as I can throw it.
This will play out. We will know eventually. Right now, Americans need help with their premiums.
Reaction to a Washington Post story that broke late Friday reporting that White House advisor and presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner sought during the transition to create a secure back-channel line to the Kremlin, sources telling our Catherine Herridge. It was the Russians who raised the issue and as a one-time event, not as a permanent hotline. Let's bring in our panel. Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles, to you first.
Well, I'm with Lindsay here. I don't trust the story. The Russians are leaking it clearly on a channel they know we're going to pick up. The Russians are masters of disinformation. They already have Washington with its knickers in a twist over the Russia conspiracy. This is an added twist. Somebody's going to get a hernia here. I think I'll stop the metaphor
if you
at that point. But we have no idea if it's true. Let's say it is true. Isn't the problem here, the accusation here, that there was some collusion during the campaign with the Russians? Well, everyone agrees if the story is true, it occurred after the campaign, during the transition. So unless there's some nefarious connection here, there's no connection to the what was alleged to have happened during the campaign. And lastly, we've had back channel connections with adversaries for generations. Henry Kissinger had them with the Russians and the Chinese. Hillary had a back channel to establish the opening of negotiations with the Iranians in what ended up as the Iranian nuclear deal.
And Barack Obama with Cuba.
It's absolutely, yeah, and the negotiations with Canada occurred in secret, occurred in Canada in secret. our negotiations with the Cubans. This happens all the time. I don't quite understand where's the crime, other than it's another piece that has Russia in the headline, Trump people in the headline, and thus it's supposed to be scandalous. Show me.
We should point out that Mr. Kushner has not been accused of any formal crime of any kind, and indeed he has, through his lawyer, pledged to cooperate with the various investigations. President Trump was quick to his son-in-law's defense, tweeting, and I quote, "Jared is doing a great job for the country. I have total confidence in him. He is respected by virtually everyone and is working on programs that will save our country billions of dollars. In addition to that," the president tweeted, and perhaps more importantly, "he is a very good person." But, Molly, is Jared Kushner now somehow suddenly a liability for this president?
Well, I mean, journalists in Washington, D.C. are living in some kind of dramatic alternate reality. They are willful participants in a coordinated leak campaign where you get selective information, half-truths. It's always without context. It's frequently incorrect. And then they use this to sort of prove the point that they've already concluded, which is that Donald Trump is a traitor in the White House. And then they backfill with information like this. In point of fact, if this is even true, such back-channel communications are quite common. I mean, President Barack Obama, before he was even elected, sent an advisor to Iran to set up back channel with that country. That was a sworn enemy of the United States. And somehow the media were able to handle that information without losing their mind. And yet here, as part of this drip, drip, drip campaign, we're supposed to believe that this is somehow quite nefarious without any evidence that it is in fact nefarious.
Chuck Lane.
Well, yeah, it's true. There's a lot of misinformation floating around in the media. I'm thinking of the conspiracy theories about Seth Rich's death. Some of the things that have come out of the White House involving the crowd estimates. So yes, we do have to be careful about the veracity of the information circulating in Washington. Having said that, unless I missed it, the White House has not denied this Washington Post story, have they? I don't think they have.
Well, sources close to Jared Kushner told our Catherine Herridge said that it wasn't his idea at all. It was the Russians, and it was a one-time.
That's different from denying. They're recasting it. Let me explain why, and I agree with all the people who said we don't know nearly enough about this. This is a very sketchy scenario at first. But it isn't true that it's totally innocent and has nothing to do with collusion, because obviously if there had been collusion during the election, this kind of special favoritism toward Russia could be the consequence of some sort of collusion and cooperation between these two people. Part of the reason people are suspicious about this is that President Trump, throughout his campaign, for what seemed to be extremely mysterious reasons, preferred one leader out of all the leaders in the whole world that he constantly praised, constantly touted as a potential American ally, and had no criticism about whatsoever, and that was Vladimir Putin of Russia. And that outstanding fact that separated him from all the other candidates, and indeed from every recent American political leader, cries out, is a very mysterious fact that cries out for explanation.
This conspiracy theory hangs on the word could. The fact that he's trying to establish a channel, or the Russians were, could indicate that there was collusion during the campaign. Could. Yes, it could also indicate that, you know, anything is possible, that they could have invented a flying machine together.
No, Charles, that's why I said That's why I said at the beginning we need to know more information about this.
In the absence of a connection, it's nothing but a conspiracy theory.
Molly. And throughout the campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly said he looked for opportunities to work with Russia. Just because he doesn't share everybody else's hysteria about a country that is not just a superpower, but a nuclear superpower, and one that you do need to have some relationship with, doesn't mean that it's nefarious again.
A country that's trying to destroy our traditional allies, a country that persecutes homosexuals.
The president also made clear throughout the stages of the campaign and even into the transition in his early days as president that it was quite possible from where he sat that he wouldn't get along at all with Vladimir Putin.
Well, of course, the irony is that relations haven't been very good.
Let me put one other thing to you, Chuck. I saw a headline on the New York Times today that I thought was fascinating. It states, simply put, a constitutional puzzle. Can the president be indicted? Chuck, is that something that's fit to print right now?
I honestly didn't read the story. It is an old conundrum of constitutional law, whether or not
is it timely? Should it be on the front page of the New York Times?
I'm actually going to say, since I didn't read the story, I'm not going to give you an opinion on live television about that.
Whether the story was expertly crafted or not, do you believe the New York Times should be reporting on its front page on, what is this, day 140 or so of the president's term, can the president be indicted?
Well,
again, I'm not going to go there because I'm not going to question the news judgment of the New York Times about...
Dr. Krauthammer, we have 30 seconds.
All I would say is that seems to assume a crime. What's the crime?
I think a lot of people are wondering about that issue. I will put it to you that way.
People where?
In America.
Mostly in newsrooms, it seems like.
No.
But in fact, in the rest of the country, people are kind of wanting journalists to get a grip and get a handle on it.
Maybe they're wondering whether Seth Rich was assassinated by Hillary Clinton, things like that. That's what they're really wondering.
Well, I mean, to raise that, here we have the President of the United States, and the question is being raised by the leading newspaper in the country as to whether or not he could be indicted, and the subtext there is imminently, right? That this is timely.
James, I already told you I didn't read the story, so I don't know what its text was, let alone its subtext.
Okay.
Whatever the text, what's the crime?
All right, stay right where you are, panel. We'll be right back with you. President Trump made quite an impression overseas, but was it a positive one? And did it, on balance, put America first? The panel will tackle that and more, maybe each other.
The times in which we can fully count on others are somewhat over, as I've experienced in the past few days. And that is why I can only say, we Europeans must really take our destiny into our own hands.
I think it's really heartbreaking. This is exactly what Putin is trying to do, is to separate the countries in the EU, to separate our NATO partners, and to drive a wedge between us.
I think it's a kind of declaration of independence on the part of Angela Merkel, and it's very good news. It basically means that Europe will be taking more responsibility for its own security. At the first glance, this seems...
Not only Memorial Day, it is the 100th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's birth. And when he took office, one of the first things he did was to reach out and assure our Western European allies at his inaugural address by saying the United States would pay any price, bear any burden. You know that well as a student of the 1960s and its history, James, to assure the survival and success of liberty. And that speech was aimed very much at West Germany, France, and Great Britain. Today we have a president who says it is unfair to the American taxpayer to pay for NATO. This tremendous historic shift in tone is now having its consequences. What Dinesh D'Souza said is not incorrect. Obviously, the circumstances, the underlying strategic considerations have changed tremendously since Kennedy's time. But the huge investment over generations in this relationship has paid very rich dividends in security and freedom for both sides of the Atlantic, and I think we're all at risk of seeing that liquidated.
The president pronounced judgment on his own first foreign trip pretty swiftly, tweeting Sunday at 8:10 in the morning, "Just returned from Europe. Trip was a great success for America. Hard work, but big results." Is that true, Molly?
I think it was undoubtedly a tremendously successful trip, and it's interesting that he was able to accomplish that with, I think, only one State Department person in place, which speaks to whether maybe the bureaucracy isn't quite as good at handling these things as maybe some people who have a different take on it. Also, I think with the Merkel thing, that was a little bit overinterpreted. She herself had many caveats in how she talked about the changes in the relationship, and it's really just common sense. Obviously, NATO countries do need to take more responsibility for their own defense. They need to allocate their resources more toward a defense posture than just sort of a glorified jobs program, and that is only right and responsible for leaders. Also, I think the media take a little bit too much interest in what other politicians are saying, foreign leaders. They give them this deference that they wouldn't give a U.S. politician not named Barack Obama. Angela Merkel obviously understands that she can use Trump as sort of an anti-immigration foil. She's got some unpopularity problems to deal with in her own country, and so we should understand that all politicians are political creatures.
To the extent that Chancellor Merkel was throwing shade at the American president after this trip, it might involve a bit of payback. After all, President Trump, as candidate Trump on the campaign trail, had a few things to say about Angela Merkel.
Hillary Clinton wants to be America's Angela Merkel. True. And you know what a disaster this massive immigration has been to Germany and the people of Germany.
What's happening in Germany, I always thought Merkel was like this great leader. What she's done in Germany is insane. It's insane.
Charles Krauthammer, I remember after the president's inaugural address on that very day, you made a point very similar to what Chuck Lane just told us, that in essence you saw the president in that inaugural address basically saying the post-war era is over, we're not the U.S. of the Marshall Plan anymore, even though those were not his words. Do you see that he has followed through on that inaugural address in his conduct on this trip?
I think so, and I was not a fan of the inaugural address. I think it's a huge mistake on our part. And I think we will rue the day that we began to sort of encourage this rift. This is Trump encouraging the rift. Yes, we do want the Europeans to take more responsibility, but in the end, the Germans, the Estonians, the Latvians are not going to hold off the Russians. This is all about Russia. The first Secretary General of NATO said the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Question the Europeans are asking, are the Americans in? What Trump does not understand is that we did not do the Marshall Plan or NATO or 70 years of leading the largest free nation alliance in history out of a sense of altruism. The point was to be the leaders of a bloc, which we are, which is prosperous, free, and which it lightens the load. If we had to defend ourselves in the Soviet era and today against the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the others all by ourselves, it would be insupportable. Alliances multiply our strength, and to the extent that we alienate them, as Trump did in his speech at NATO, it is a detriment to our national security.
The newly elected French president, Emmanuel Macron, spoke about that white-knuckle handshake with President Trump and said, my handshake with him, it wasn't innocent. It's not the be-all and end-all of a policy, or I think he said alpha and omega, but it was a moment of truth. Chuck Lane, do you think that European leaders are implacably opposed to working with Donald Trump, or do you